The word soul or psyche is a literary symbol standing for the unconscious organic destiny present in living seeds and in living bodies. In this sense, the ancients could reasonably speak of a soul of the world, since the world has a recognizable, though imperfect, order of movements, full of power and beauty. To this animating form or dominant system of tropes, we may give the more modern name of universal will, provided we are aware of using this term poetically after the descriptive manner of Schopenhauer and other German philosophers. I will scrupulously write the word, when used in this sense, with a capital, and understand by it the observable endeavor in things of any sort to develop a specific form and to preserve it. Such descriptive use of terms like will and endeavor is less metaphorical than it might seem. Undoubtedly, in literary psychology and in sophisticated modern speech, these words are meant to designate movements of the spirit, emotions, expectations, wishes, decisions, commands, or prayers. We are here discussing the realm of spirit, and need not stop to repeat that such a moral and imaginative sphere exists, that there is an immaterial intensity in feeling and an immaterial light in intuition. But spirit, once clearly discerned and admitted, how shall we distinguish its various phases? Suppose I am thirsty. My distress, in so far as it is conscious, is a spiritual trial. But what is it about? About the state of my body? Or if perhaps there is only a dream image that haunts me, it will be an image of water and of myself about to drink, but prevented. Similarly with every other object of passion, even the most impersonally moral or political. There will be some dream image of what might happen in the world, how people might be living, how they might be shouting for joy, and unanimously asserting everything that I believe. I may imagine that what I long for is a union of pure spirits, but that is a verbal delusion. Spirits cannot be united unless persons are distinguished, and persons can be distinguished only in a physical world. What I long for is life in a world to come, peopled by natural bodies. In my purest will, I am experiencing one physical process and desiring another. My behavior and the events expected to follow are the sole discoverable parts of the entire history. In these only could my conscious will find evidence of any ideal unanimities. In using the word will for these two connected movements in nature, one in human behavior, the other in its effects and conditions, we are not feigning, then, anything psychological behind or within inanimate processes. We are rather recognizing the original seat of those conflicts and endeavors which agitate the spirit only because, in the first place, they agitate the animal psyche and the material world. Note, Hobbes used the word endeavor in this way. Had his usage been adopted, English philosophy might have begun with behaviorism instead of ending with it. According to this use of terms, the psyche becomes a particular instance of universal will, found whenever the form to be maintained is organic and preserved by nutrition and reproduction. Then spirit, too, may be called an expression of will, since it arises at a specially energetic phase in the life of the psyche, namely, when the range of adjustment and control begins to extend beyond the body. For so long as life remains purely vegetative, it seems to be unconscious. No doubt there are internal sensations in animals which may precede external perception, but no organ would be morally sensitive or conscious if cut off from the other organs and from the brain, so that the spirit seems to be allied to messages, even if these be internal to one organism. We may then say that spirit arises whenever will in one place finds it profitable to mark, trace, and even imitatively to share the movement of will elsewhere. By so doing, a psyche anticipates attack and defense, putting forth telepathic feelers, as it were, indefinitely far into space and time, to mark, to trace, or to share any and every movement going on in the world is precisely the function of spirit. Only that for spirit this marking, tracing, or sharing is purely ideal, and being ideal may tend to become adequate to the life of the object, whereas marking, tracing, and sharing for the psyche involve only a material response and an instinctive readjustment. The concomitance of these two phases, one automatic and the other emotional, binds us to their complete ontological diversity. Each actually involves and instantly suggests the other, so that under the name of either the entire natural event may be safely indicated. But to indicate an event is not to describe it, much less to analyze it. Any feature, any nickname or gesture suffices to represent to the cursory mind the most complex of facts, and we thread our way automatically through the world by the help of a few superficial signals to which we hardly attend, while our thoughts go wool gathering or are lost in the haze of bodily sensation, when rarely, in reflective moments, we realize our spiritual solitude. We begin to wonder how nature, all brute accidents, ever came to confront spirit, all ideal demands. And the contrast between these conjoined enemies becomes mysterious to us, or even scandalous. Perhaps then we grow speculative and attempt to reduce nature to a figment of mind, as if the world were an idea to be easily downed or exercised by another idea. Or perhaps we dream of introducing spirit like a mighty blast amid the tempests of nature, so as to direct or to pacify them. But these are the illusions of egotism, abounding in its own sense, and ignorant of its foundations. The foundations of spirit are in the life of nature. Nothing could be more natural or spontaneous than this running hypostasis of vital changes into prophetic and symbolic intuitions. The world is not only a patient artist in its structure, but a rapt poet in its sentiment. Why should it not be? And how should this ever be the case with us if, in essence and potentially, it were not the case in our ancestral substance? Such, whether sophisticated people call it natural or miraculous, is at any rate the fact. Tensions, movements, unities, that in the realm of matter are mere forms or tropes, give birth to intensive moral and conscious echoes in the realm of spirit. Thereby, the fertility of the physical order ceases to be vain and proves itself to be greater than our partisan minds like to at first admit. In reality, substance and form, mechanism and lyric actuality are interwoven and contrasted in nature's own way, with radical freedom, since opportunity was infinite, yet with blind perseverance, since when one experiment is afoot, why should another experiment interrupt it? There is time and there is room for everything in infinity, even for ourselves. We have, therefore, no occasion to deny or to minimize the difference between mind and matter. Peace between disparate things is not to be secured by assimilating them. Assimilation would destroy at least one of them, and probably both, and the result would not be a harmony but a material confluence of uniform parts. If reality were all of one kind, elements could agree only by repeating one another or by moving in the same current, like the drops of water in a river. The will in each molecule, the force by which it coheres, would be unaffected by the direction of which the molecule as a whole might be carried, so long as it was not disrupted, and the politics of the world will remain entirely indifferent to the citizens. Such indifference brings with it a negative peace. The part is not troubled by the whole, and the whole need not trouble about itself, since in the dynamic sphere accommodation imposes itself automatically at every moment and is necessarily perfect. Universal will, by definition, cannot but be realized, being a name for the continually renewed balance and resultant of all forces. Wholly different are the conditions of harmony when molecules have become plastic organisms, and organisms, always imperfect, have reached great elaboration in incomparable directions. In their fortunes, they must continue to conform involuntarily to universal will, but their different wills are partly defeated in the process. Compromise may soften this partial defeat by accepting it. We then surrender a native potentiality for the sake of something more opportune, which may graft itself on the original stem and create a new will no less genuine than the old one. Or if the original will was strongly organized, the compromise may be only provisional, as when a conquered nationality sullenly vegetates until an occasion comes for recovering its independence, or as a married pair chafes under the yoke, meditating freedom. But all alien forces are not hostile to a healthy will that nature has adopted and rendered perennial. Adaptation, far from being a compromise or a mutilation, may be a happy development, bringing out latent faculties of the psyche, and enriching life with an increased relevance and responsiveness to different orders of things. A system of moral relations, lying in the realm of truth, will then be found radiating from each organic being, multiplying its connections and increasing its distinction, because these relations will be based on native affinities of each psyche and selected freely, so that the more life expands in those congenial lines, the more it becomes what it willed to be. Such is the harmony possible among disparate things, a correlation of different orders of beings, rendered each more distinct and the whole more diversified. Out of such a harmony established at the biological level, spirit was born. And the farther and the more perfectly that harmony can spread round the psyche, the better the will in spirit is fulfilled. Nothing could be ontologically more unlike nature than spirit is, yet nothing could be better able to mold itself in its own ideal manner to every detail and convolution in nature, so as to survey it and know it. Nothing could diversify and enrich nature more radically, adding a moral dimension to what would otherwise be merely material. Nothing could more freely or triumphantly express its own will than spirit does by once feeling and transcending the will of everything else. If spirit in us could be entirely dominant, we should esteem everything in nature as if it were the inmost part of ourselves, and everything in ourselves as if it were the remotest and the least part of nature. But the actual life of spirit is all compromise, being continually stopped in its flights and enslaved by some particular passion or illusion. To that extent, spirit is not spiritual and exists only in a thwarted effort to be born. Once clear, however, even if only for a moment and in some particular direction, it is out of sight of compromise. It is fed by everything while it wakes and disturbed by nothing while it sleeps. Its existence becomes a pure gain both to itself and to the world that contains it, and that thereby completes in self-knowledge the cycle of its normal life. But here we come upon a paradox, that spirit, the most inward of things and the most vital, should find its purest affinities in remote and abstract regions, in mathematics, in music, in truth, in the wider aspects of nature and history, and should find its greatest enemies, its worst torments, at home. The stars are more friendly to it than the mountains than the town than the workshop or the garret, and its irreconcilable foes are its own body and its own passions. Yet this was inevitable in view of the animal roots of spirit in the psyche. An animal organism in developing smell, sight, and hearing adjusts itself to external things, merely confirming and studying its own life. This sensibility to the not self arises entirely in the self's service. Those far-reaching senses are not speculative in their will, but defensive or aggressive, and the mechanism that generates and supports them necessarily subserves the welfare of the body. If it did not, it would tend to destroy that body and to annul itself. Yet meantime, by that useful trick of exact adaptation and imitative sympathy, the psyche has automatically generated spiritual sympathy and true intelligence, without in the least requiring these gifts or profiting by them. A purely ideal consciousness of things not hers has sprung up within herself. She has given birth to a spirit that potentially, in its intellectual vocation, infinitely transcends her. How does this come about? Under what auspices does a moral dimension, mechanically non-existent and biologically idle, attach itself to physical life. I think an answer of a certain kind is not far to seek. Everything finite in the bosom of the infinite reckons without its host. The great residuum that it ignores nevertheless continues to beat against those bounds, like the sea upon a coral island. And not only from the outside, there is probably an infinity surging within, as well as one laughing round the corner. Now, a very tight and simple organism might resist this double solicitation almost forever, or might reappear perpetually almost without change. But the more complex an organism becomes, the more it will lean upon external support, and the more everything in it will come to be an index to the things it is not. There are commitments and dangers enough in vegetative life, but these are immensely extended by the organ of spirit, by the whole perceptive, aggressive, and teachably reflex machinery of the animal psyche. The human race, in particular, has entered upon an ambitious and glorious career, acquiring a dominion over the universe perceptively and over the earth industrially that would seem incredible if it were not actual. Such enterprise on the psyche's part was no blunder, unless we judge life itself to be a blunder. Nature has simply explored the possibilities of organization and run the inevitable risk of confusion and disaster. This is normal, as is also the inner conflict and strain that so complex an equipment, with its parts working intermittently, imposes upon the psyche. A visit to the zoo may convince anybody that this is no prerogative of man, much less a miraculous inroad of spirit into nature. All those odd animals are seen straining under the burden of their oddity. Many of them are already almost extinct. Many others were extinct long ago. Perhaps the oddity of man, that interest of his in things not edible, which issues in art and intelligence, may also prove fatal. And if, so far, on the whole, the experiment has proved physically useful, it has been at the price of terrible inner conflicts, reaching war and organized tyranny in the race and madness in the individual. In no other creature, probably, is the natural soul so much distracted. In no other has the margin of life encroached so much upon the text. No clean, clear stretches of contented idleness to be for other animals, but a margin crowded with comments and contradictions and caricatures and cross-references, demanding that we attend to everything at once and live not bravely forward as other animals do, but continually looking backward, or far ahead, or suspiciously, greedily, impertinently, and frivolously in every direction. We talk of life as if it were unquestionably something precious or even divine. Perhaps a part of the vocation of spirit may be to overcome this precious. Life, where it has arisen, is by definition a nucleus of will and a point of reference for imputing good and evil. But who should impute good and evil, or in reference to what will, in those vast cosmic regions that surround and that breathe life, so that life itself, before it existed, should be declared a good? Physical life and an animal psyche are not ultimate categories. They are not the primary movements or tensions in the universe. The potentialities of matter far outrun any such temporary tropes. The scale on which the psyche operates is a local scale, and the perceptive organs that she develops are biased, selective organs. Many deeper or subtler currents, as well as much vaster harmonies, presumably run through the world and flow unimpeded through the psyche as through a sieve. In her special interest, she can afford to ignore them, but she lives immersed and saturated in them, nevertheless, and it was precisely when she availed herself of some of these currents, at first disregarded, that her organs of sense acquired their extra bodily range. Then, in becoming physically perceptive, she became, against her primary will, vitally extroverted. She began to live and to suffer where, materially, she was not. Her heart, so to speak, began to travel. All this was in her simply an organic crisis or fever, but it set her dreaming, as a fever will, in a deep sleep. For the first time she felt a real pang, the birth pang of the spirit, and she saw a clear image, her first notion of a world. It was a strange self-displacement, like falling in love. In her ambition to grow, she had become so great that she discovered her littleness, and henceforth it was impossible for her to go back or to draw in her horns. If in nostalgia for vegetative peace she now shut her eyes and risked being mistaken, her new and formidable friends would escape her, and she might no longer escape her old enemies, because her shell would have been broken, and now her greater sensitiveness and more precarious life would have multiplied their number and exposed her much more to their attacks. Thus, a pragmatic mechanism that operates with no reference to the truth nevertheless must meet and bow to the truth and its adjustments. And the truth, having divine prerogatives grounded more deeply and widely in the universe than any particular life, rewards the respect shown to it by a miraculous but appropriate gift, namely by a vision of the truth. Clouded as this vision may be, it is essentially a vision of all reality. It flashes like sheet lightning, broadly but unseizably, and only for a moment in every intuition of the spirit. With this disproportionate dignity and ambition breaks in upon animal life, strangely incongruous, pregnant with repentance and with exaltation above mortality. But the psyche cannot repent, it cannot stop feeding, breeding, and acting. She must persist or die, and it is only the spirit that can repent for her and suffer for her until it achieves its own liberty. In this way, like an ignorant girl, the psyche has become a mother without counting the cost either to herself or to her miraculous child, and the spirit has come undesired into the working world that wanted only another slave and is utterly incapable of understanding or respecting the divine changeling that has been brought to it. Evidently, for the preservation and welfare of an organism, fit reactions suffice. A sense of those reactions or their occasions is superfluous. And in fact, the core of the human psyche, which is like that of other animals, might decline all responsibility for such a dispersion of affection, or even deny that it existed. Adaptation creates intelligence, but does not know that it does so. When the will in an animal began to react upon and to mimic external objects, it was bent only on absorbing or on dominating those objects materially. The habit of retracting the environment and, as it were, sinking into it and catching its rhythm was something secondary, instrumental, and oblique, and the response was strictly practical, touching only what touched the organism. But such a selection cannot be made beforehand. In exploring, you cannot first decide what you shall discover. You must explore everything that offers, and then perhaps select the part that it concerns you to study. Now, it is precisely this preliminary but indomitable interest in fact, in form, and in truth, for truth's sake, that is the will proper to spirit, a will that wills heroically what the psyche as a whole willed only conditionally and, as it were, unwillingly. For by sensitively adjusting herself to opportunities, she inevitably bred in herself a frank affinity to other things and even to contrary wills. She found herself hypnotically rehearsing alien movements, without any possibility of absorbing substances that so moved, and willy-nilly such an ideal possession of things materially absent in mind. It is spirit. The spirit is spontaneous, disinterested, intellectual in its essence, but it does not live, as sometimes it imagines, only in its own resources or by its own power. It is the psyche that creates spirit in becoming materially sensitive to remote things, and it is this living, natural individual that in generating spirit renders his vital unity moral and acquires a mental cognizance of the world and of himself in the midst of it. We should be antedating the birth of spirit and turning our symbols into myths if we asked whether the psyche made a mistake in developing such speculation. She was led into an experiment rich in possibilities and in dangers. It could not be called a mistake, even if someday, or in many cases, it proved fatal, because all experiments in the end prove fatal if we regard them as aimed at some specific good, but they all prove fertile as well, since they enable new forms to arise. We shall trace presently some of the conflicts which the will underlying spirit has caused in the individual and in society. They are biological conflicts, confusions in the play of organic impulses, but it would always be a private judgment inspired by one or another of these impulses to say that the psyche ought to have remained vegetative so as to avoid these conflicts, or that in becoming partly disinterested, that is, in generating spirit, she was false to her own interests. In her own life, she simply developed new organs, the senses, organic memory, language, the arts, because she had the potency and the occasion to do so. And as to the life of spirit that thereby supervened, she gained and she lost absolutely nothing by it, since spirit is immaterial, neither a drain nor an influence, and merely concomitant to her life, like a shadow, a truth, or a harmony. If the life of the psyche could ever become wholly disinterested and sacrificial, which would involve becoming materially passive and barren, The will achieved would be exclusively the will in spirit, and in that supreme moment, the spirit would live absolutely and sublimely free. But that would mean physical death, or a transport equivalent to a suspension of physical life, a condition that may be approached or traversed, but that cannot be sustained. The will in spirit, therefore, does not enjoy the privilege which the will in the vegetative psyche always retains, the privilege of suspending the experiment by which spirit was evoked and retreating into unconsciousness. To retreat, or rather to soar, into pure spirit is a continual tendency or goal in intellectual and moral life. It appears in the idea of God when God is conceived spiritually. It is frequently touched or skirted by the innocent mind, but it cannot be maintained or made the staple of any existence. Spirit is not a substance with a life of its own. If it were, it could never have got entangled in these animal meshes. It is a consciousness of animal aspirations already afoot. Even the aspiration to see, to understand, and to experience everything is at bottom an animal aspiration that needs to be radically transmuted before it can become a spiritual one. The whole experience of spirit expresses natural predicaments. Spirit suffers hunger and thirst. It hates, it fears, it loves, it inquires, it feels perplexed and forsaken. It is merely the psyche become conscious. Therefore, any dream of being pure spirit, omniscient, safe, and joyful represents only an ideal limit, an ambition intimately involved in being spirit at all, but not attainable in its purity. Sometimes the flame grows brighter, sometimes it sinks, in proportion as the vital synthesis of the moment contracts to the scope of some single interest or trouble, or extends to remoter influences and greater destinies. At best, under the spell of nature and truth, intuition may almost draw the whole psyche out of her native molds and concentrate her energies in intelligence, in fancy, or in worship. At such moments, the will at work in the spirit becomes unanimous with the will of nature working beyond the animal soul. In religious parlance, it becomes identical with the will of God. Although the spirit always suffers more or less, and sometimes suffers cruelly, yet in one sense it is less pathetic, less helplessly wasted than the vegetative psyche that never dies, that never suffers consciously, but simply crops out, struggles, and dies. Spirit dies too, but with the knowledge of its essential capacity to rise again, so that it rather sleeps than dies, and all its sufferings in so many incarnations are properly not its own, but those of the animal organism which for the moment it inhabits, and which, but for this descent of spirit, would have been condemned to grow, to work, and to die without ever loving anything ideally or knowing its own raison d'etre. The objects we see the psyche pursuing are results in which she would rest, conditions in which she would prosper, not perfections that, before she evokes spirit, she could ever worship or desire. She lives as long as she can, on any terms, until her mechanism snaps, and her struggles are so vainly persistent and desperate precisely because they are blind. Courage, we call this mechanical impulse and enlist it morally in our heroisms, but in the psyche it is a mere potentiality of heroism and also of madness. When instinct prompts, she will boldly lay any wager and double it against any odds. The advent of spirit cannot abolish these vital impulses and mortal dangers, but in raising them into conscious suffering and love, spirit turns the ignominy of blind existence into nobleness, setting before us some object to suffer for and to pursue. In the very act of becoming painful, life has become worth living in its own eyes.